In the autumn of 1877, a conservator at a private museum in the Flemish lowlands opened a cedar-lined crate that had been shipped from a dissolved estate in the Carpathian hill country. Inside, packed in sawdust that smelled of pine resin and something older, something mineral and unnameable, was a device the size of a writing desk constructed of an alloy no metallurgist he contacted could identify. It had gears. It had chambers. It had 9 distinct rotating components, whose tolerances, when measured against the finest Swiss clockwork of that era, were tighter, not comparable, tighter. He photographed it before the estate solicitors arrived 3 days later and had it removed without documentation. That photograph exists. It is not alone. I have spent 11 years in the documentation trade. I began as a junior conservator handling pre-industrial metalwork, which means I spent my early career learning exactly what forges, foundries, and fabrication methods of any given century were capable of producing. I know the grain patterns of hand-hammered iron. I know the casting anomalies that appear in 19th century bronze when molten metal cools too quickly in an open mold. I know what a pre-industrial joint looks like under magnification, and I know what it does not look like. What I am about to describe does not look like anything that should exist in the photographic record of that era. There are 12 of them. 12 devices, some called machines, some called instruments, some called apparatus by the men who photographed them, captured on glass plate negatives between approximately 1840 and 1878. 12 objects that have since vanished from institutional record. 12 photographs whose originals have been scattered, misfiled, destroyed, or simply disappeared from the collections that once held them. I have located, between my own archive and the collections of 3 independent researchers who have since ceased corresponding, 11 of the original photographs and credible secondary documentation of the 12th. What those photographs show is not what the official history of 19th century engineering says was possible, not even close. Before I go further, the algorithm tends to bury this kind of investigation. If you want to follow where the evidence leads, subscribing is how you make sure the next one reaches you. The first machine I want to tell you about appeared in a photograph taken in the Rhineland in approximately 1851. It was photographed by an itinerant commercial photographer named in the estate record of a Prussian industrialist as a contractor for inventory documentation. His name is listed, his invoice is preserved, but his subsequent whereabouts are unrecorded after that commission. The photograph shows a device, roughly 4 meters in length. It sits in a stone-floored basement room. It has 8 articulated arm-like extensions, each terminating in a fitted cup or nozzle of refined construction, and at its center a compression chamber ringed by what appears to be a valve system of considerable sophistication. It is not a steam engine. The proportions are wrong. The valve configuration is wrong, and there is no evident firebox or water reservoir. When I showed a high-resolution copy of this photograph to a precision mechanical engineer whose work I trust absolutely, he stared at it for 7 minutes without speaking. Then he said, "That valve array implies pressure management on a scale we did not achieve systematically until the 1930 seconds. In 1851, there is no industrial context for this object. None. The second photograph is harder to dismiss because it has a paper trail. In 1858, a regional mechanical exposition in the industrial corridor south of Lyon accepted entries from independent inventors and awarded certificates of merit to devices judged by a panel of engineers. The surviving exposition catalog lists 41 entries. Entry number 26 is described as a reciprocating fluid transfer mechanism with a closed-loop recovery system, which is, in plain language, a device that recycled its own operating medium to sustain motion without continuous external input. The panel's notes, which I found transcribed in a private journal belonging to one of the panel members, a journal that was never published and spent the last 40 years in a family estate before its contents were donated to a small regional library, described the device as operating for 45 minutes on the exposition floor without any visible replenishment of any fuel or fluid. The panel member's journal entry concludes with a single sentence that I have read many times. It says, "We agreed unanimously not to award this entry a certificate, as we could not explain it, and we could not publish what we could not explain. The device left the exposition the same day. The inventor's name is listed only as a regional abbreviation that corresponds to no individual I have been able to trace. I will come back to what connects these devices." But first, let me tell you about the photograph from the Naval Survey. In 1864, a maritime cartographer stationed at a survey outpost on the northern Atlantic rim filed a set of inventory photographs document equipment found at an abandoned coastal research installation. The installation itself was listed as having been in operation for an indeterminate period, its founding records absent. Among the survey photographs was an image of a device the cartographer described in his attached notes as a rotational measuring instrument of unknown function. It had a central spindle assembly and an outer ring calibrated in gradations too fine to be read without magnification. What struck the cartographer, what he recorded in his notes with evident confusion, was that the calibration markings appeared to reference astronomical positions, not navigation bearings, astronomical positions. This device, in an abandoned coastal station whose origin no one could document, was apparently built to track something in the sky at a precision level that no civilian optical equipment of that era could match. The cartographer's survey was filed with a regional maritime authority. His photographs were archived. 40 years later, a researcher attempting to access that archive was informed that the relevant volumes had been reclassified and were no longer available for public consultation. The cartographer's name had been removed from the index. I want you to hold that pattern in your mind, because it repeats. The fourth machine appeared in a photograph taken in the American interior, specifically in the industrial outskirts of a Great Lakes manufacturing city, sometime between 1868 and 1872. The photograph came to my attention through a private collector who had purchased a lot of glass plates at a state auction. Among the plates was a single image showing a factory floor and, at its far end, a machine partially obscured by shadow. The machine was partially assembled or partially disassembled. It is impossible to determine which. What is visible is a drive shaft of exceptional diameter connected to a series of reduction gears whose ratio, estimated by two independent engineers I consulted, implies an output torque we associate with mid-20th century heavy industrial applications. The factory floor around it holds workers of normal 19th century industrial appearance. The scale of those workers against the machine is what stops you cold. The shaft alone stands taller than the men beside it. This was not catalogued in any known patent record of that era. I have checked the patent registries of 4 nations. I have found nothing that corresponds to this machine's dimensions and apparent drive configuration in any official industrial record before 1900. Here's what I had not yet understood when I first encountered these photographs separately. They were not accidents. They were not isolated curiosities. They were a pattern, and the pattern had a suppressor. The financial cartels of the Gilded Age did not merely control industry. They controlled the record of industry. The major dynastic interests of the 1,882nds and 1,890nds held ownership stakes, not just in foundries and rail companies, but in the institutional bodies that certified industrial knowledge. The engineering societies, the patent review boards, the museum collections that documented the history of technology. When a new device appeared whose capabilities challenged the narrative of industrial progress that legitimized their monopoly position, the narrative that said human engineering had climbed a clean, unbroken ladder from simple to complex, the machinery of that narrative's suppression was already in place. You did not need a conspiracy meeting, you needed only institutional gravity. When the leading metallurgical review journal of the 1,890nds was funded by 3 of the same dynastic interests that held primary patents on the dominant industrial processes of that decade, it did not require a directive to ensure that anomalous metallurgical evidence went unpublished. It required only the ordinary incentives of institutional self-preservation. I want to be careful here. I am not claiming I know what these machines were. What I am claiming is documented. The photographs exist. The machines in those photographs demonstrate engineering capabilities inconsistent with their documented era, and the documentary trail around those machines, the provenance records, the institutional archives, the patent filings, the exhibition records, has been systematically hollowed out. Not in every case, not perfectly, but consistently enough that the pattern is itself the evidence. Let me give you the machine that troubles me most. In 1873, a private exhibition was held in a city in the northeastern corner of the Austro-Hungarian administrative zone, a city known in that era for small precision manufacturing, particularly clock mechanisms and optical instruments. The exhibition was organized by a consortium of independent inventors and displayed, according to the surviving catalog copy I located in a private archive 2 years ago, 17 devices of novel construction. The catalog describes them in the dense technical language of that era, and most are recognizable: improved loom mechanisms, modified press configurations, refined optical bench arrangements. But one entry, listed without an inventor name and noted only as displayed on behalf of an unidentified foreign principal, describes a device the catalog calls a resonant compression apparatus with self-regulating thermal output. The catalog entry runs to nearly a full page. It describes a machine that in operation generated sustained heat without combustion. No fuel input is described, no firebox, no chemical process. Sustained thermal output from a mechanical process whose principle the catalog author evidently did not understand well enough to explain clearly, because the description breaks down into approximation and analogy. That exhibition catalog was not printed in large numbers. I have located 2 surviving copies. The entry for that device has been physically excised, cut cleanly from the page in one of them. The other copy, which I photographed personally, still has the text, and the text is exactly as strange as it sounds. The photographer who documented that exhibition produced 12 glass plate images of the displayed devices. I have found 3 of them. The resonant compression apparatus is not among the 3 I have found. The other 9 plates are unaccounted for. There's a shape to how photographic evidence of these machines disappeared. It is not random. Random disappearance produces scattered losses across a collection. A plate broken here, a volume misfiled there, a negative deteriorated from improper storage. What the documentary record of these 12 machines shows instead is concentrated loss. The specific plates in the specific collections that documented the most anomalous capabilities are the ones that are gone. The surrounding material, other plates from the same photographer, other volumes from the same archive, survives in normal proportion. Only the specific documentation of these specific devices has been excised. The statistical probability of that pattern arising from ordinary archival attrition is not something I can calculate precisely. But I can tell you that every archivist I have consulted, when shown the pattern without being told my conclusion, has reached the same one independently. This is not attrition. This is selection. I want to tell you about one more before the synthesis, because it is the one that closes the argument for me. The 11th photograph, I have never found the 12th, only its secondary documentation, was taken at a Pacific coastal dry dock facility in 1876. A harbor engineer contracted to assess the facility's existing equipment. Inventory photographed every tool and machine on the premises before recommending which to retain and which to scrap. His photographic inventory survives in a maritime heritage collection, 41 photographs. In photograph 37, visible on a lower dock platform, partially covered by a canvas tarpaulin, is a device of substantial size whose exposed components show what I can only describe as a compound mechanical transmission, unlike any documented drive system of that century. The gear geometry is not consistent with any transmission design in the patent literature before 1910. The engineer's inventory notes describe the object only as existing apparatus, origin unknown, condition good, function unclear, recommend retention pending further assessment. There is no further assessment in the record. The device does not appear in any subsequent inventory of the facility. The harbor engineer's notes contain no follow-up entry. The canvas tarpaulin in the photograph is the last thing anyone in the documentary record ever mentions. And the gear geometry is still unexplained, which brings me to the question 11 years of research has not answered. If these machines existed, and the photographic and documentary evidence I have assembled argues strongly that they did, then where did they come from? The official history of 19th century engineering is a history of incremental development, each advance built demonstrably on the last. The fossil record of industrial innovation is unusually complete, precisely because patents, trade exhibitions, manufacturing contracts, and institutional publications created documentation at every step. There are no large gaps in the paper trail of steam power development. There are no mystery periods in the documented evolution of precision clockwork. The history of industrial metallurgy in the 19th century is exceptionally well documented. which means that an alloy of unknown composition, machined to tolerances that would not be standard until the next century, appearing in a private Flemish basement in 1877, is not an anomaly that can be explained by an overlooked chapter. Something was present in the physical world that was not present in the documented record. That gap between what was photographed and what was officially acknowledged is not the gap of innocent oversight. It is the gap of deliberate management. Were these devices the surviving remnants of an earlier technical tradition, preserved and passed through private channels outside the institutional knowledge economy? Were they the products of independent parallel development, inventors working in isolation who achieved capabilities their era officially had no context for, and who were quietly absorbed or silenced by the financial powers that needed the narrative of controlled progress intact? Were they something else entirely, something the photographic record alone is not sufficient to characterize? I do not have the final answer. I have 12 photographs. I have the metallurgical assessments of 3 independent engineers who cannot reconcile what they see with what the historical record says was possible. I have a pattern of archival excision that is too consistent to be accidental. And I have the name of an institutional network, not one organization, but a constellation of societies, journals, and collection-holding bodies, that was in a position to control what the historical record of industrial innovation contained, and that had every financial incentive to do so. The machines remember what the record forgot. The question is whether we are willing to read what they were built to say. Share this with one person who asks the right questions. That is how this kind of knowledge survives. I will see you in the next investigation. Until then, check the alloy composition.